In the summer of 1944, a group of German officers came within seconds of killing Adolf Hitler, and one of the most famous military commanders in the world was connected to their plot. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the man the British called the Desert Fox, the general who had humiliated Allied forces across North Africa, was implicated in the conspiracy that nearly ended the Third Reich from within. The bomb exploded. Hitler survived. And what happened to Rommel in the months that followed was darker than any battlefield defeat he had ever suffered. Two generals would arrive at his quiet villa with an ultimatum directly from Hitler himself. By the end of that afternoon, Rommel would be dead. His wife and teenage son were inside the house when it happened. The regime announced that he had succumbed to wounds from an earlier attack. They gave him a state funeral with full military honors. His family stood at the ceremony knowing the truth, and they said nothing. The story of Erwin Rommel is not just about tanks and desert warfare. It's about a man who rose to become one of the most celebrated commanders of the Second World War, earned the respect of enemies who should have hated him, and ended his life forced to choose between poison and public execution. Erwin Johannes Eugen Rommel was born on November 15, 1891, in the small town of Heidenheim in the Kingdom of Württemberg, part of the German Empire. His father was a schoolteacher, his mother came from a prominent local family, and nothing about his childhood suggested the military career that would follow. He was described as a quiet, studious boy who showed talent in mathematics but little early interest in soldiering. That changed when he joined the Imperial German Army in 1910 as an officer cadet, beginning a path that would define the rest of his life. World War I revealed what Rommel actually was. He served on multiple fronts, including France and Romania, but it was the Italian front that made his reputation. In October 1917, during the Battle of Caporetto, Lieutenant Rommel led a small force in a series of daring attacks that captured thousands of Italian prisoners and several strategic positions. His actions during that campaign earned him the Pour le Mérite, Imperial Germany's highest military decoration for valor, often called the Blue Maximum. He was just 25 years old. The young officer who emerged from World War I had tactical instincts far beyond his years. He understood movement, surprise, and the psychological power of speed, ideas that would later reshape modern warfare. In 1937, he published Infantry Attacks, based on his experiences on the Italian front. It became a military classic, studied by officers around the world, including those who would later face him in North Africa. What nobody could have predicted was how the next war would transform him from a respected tactician into a legend. When Hitler rose to power in 1933, Rommel, like most German officers, pledged allegiance to the new regime. Historians have debated his motivations and the timeline of his political loyalties, but what's clear is that he benefited enormously from Nazi Germany's expansion of the military. He commanded Hitler's personal security battalion for a period, gaining direct access to the Führer and positioning himself for rapid advancement. By the time Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Rommel was a general officer hungry for a combat command. In February 1940, he took command of the 7th Panzer Division, just months before the invasion of France. Over the next 6 weeks, his speed and aggression made him nearly impossible to track. He advanced so fast that even German command lost sight of him. His unit became known as the Ghost Division, striking suddenly and disappearing before the enemy could react. France collapsed in 6 weeks, shocking the world. Rommel emerged as a star, personally promoted by Hitler and celebrated as the face of Germany's military success. If you're finding this video I created for you useful, take a second to subscribe, because what happened next in North Africa is where the legend really began. In February 1941, Rommel took command of the Deutsches Afrika Korps, sent to Libya to rescue Italy's collapsing campaign. He was meant to hold the line, but within weeks, he launched an offensive that pushed British forces back hundreds of miles. The desert was perfect for his style, fast, aggressive, unpredictable. He led from the front, often far ahead of his own troops, taking risks most generals avoided. British forces were constantly reacting, never in control. They gave him a nickname that stuck, the Desert Fox. In Germany, he became a legend. In Britain, even Winston Churchill publicly acknowledged his skill, an unusual tribute to an enemy commander. the phrase "war without hate" became associated with the North African campaign, suggesting a cleaner, more chivalrous form of conflict than the brutal ideological warfare on the Eastern Front. Rommel allegedly refused to carry out illegal orders, including directives to execute prisoners and captured commandos. His treatment of Allied soldiers earned him respect that extended beyond the battlefield. That reputation has been contested by some historians who point to crimes committed against Jewish populations in North Africa, though others note there is no clear evidence Rommel was personally involved or even aware of these actions. The truth, like much about Rommel, remains complicated. One of the strangest parts of Rommel's legacy is the respect he earned from his enemies. British commanders like Claude Auchinleck and Bernard Montgomery, along with Americans like George Patton, openly admired his tactics. Even decades later, generals like Norman Schwarzkopf called him a master of mobile warfare. His influence spread globally. Leaders like Moshe Dayan and Ariel Sharon studied his methods, and his campaigns became case studies in military academies. But not everyone agreed. Critics argued Rommel was overrated, brilliant tactically, but weak strategically. They pointed to his disregard for logistics and command structure, which contributed to failure in North Africa. And logistics were the real problem, especially fuel. Rommel himself admitted his operations were often dictated by how much gasoline he had. Supply lines across the Mediterranean were constantly attacked, and shortages crippled his army. The illusion of strength couldn't last. By October 1942, at El Alamein, Montgomery stopped his advance. By May 1943, Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. Rommel's legend remained, but the reality was clear: even the best tactics can't overcome broken supply lines. Rommel's final assignment came in 1944, when he was sent to France to strengthen the Atlantic Wall against an Allied invasion. He argued tanks should be placed near the beaches for immediate response, but others disagreed. Hitler's compromise split the forces and weakened the defense. On June 6, 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy. Rommel wasn't there; he had returned home, believing the weather made an invasion unlikely. He rushed back and joined the fight. On July 17, his car was strafed by a British fighter. The crash left him severely wounded, with a fractured skull. He was sent to Germany to recover, unaware that his fate was already unfolding. 3 days later, the July 20 plot to kill Hitler failed. As the Gestapo investigated, Rommel's name surfaced. Whether he was directly involved is still debated, but to Hitler, suspicion was enough. The regime couldn't risk a public trial of its most famous general. A different solution was needed. On the morning of October 14, 1944, 2 generals arrived at Rommel's villa in Herlingen, a quiet village near Ulm where he had been recovering from his injuries. Wilhelm Bergdorf was chief of the Army Personnel Office. Ernst Maisel was an investigator assigned to the July 20 plot. They carried Hitler's personal ultimatum. Rommel could choose to face the People's Court, where conviction and execution were absolutely certain. His family would be stripped of everything, his wife and son left disgraced and likely imprisoned or worse. Alternatively, he could take his own life. If he chose suicide, the regime promised a state funeral with full military honors. The public would be told he had died from his wounds. His wife Lucy and 15-year-old son Manfred would receive a field marshal's pension, and their safety would be guaranteed. The house was already surrounded. SS men in civilian clothes had taken positions around the property before the generals arrived. There would be no escape, no negotiation, no appeal. Rommel asked for time to speak with his family. If you're still here, subscribing helps me reach more people, because what happened next would remain hidden for months. Lucy urged Rommel to fight the charges, but he believed it was hopeless. Even if he survived a trial, the regime would find another way. The deal was clear: his death would protect his family. He put on his Afrika Korps jacket, picked up his baton, and walked to the waiting car. He never looked back. Minutes later, he took the cyanide capsule. Within 10 minutes, Lucy received the call: her husband was dead. For days later, Rommel was given a full state funeral. Hitler declared a day of mourning, and the public was told he died from his wounds. The truth was buried beneath propaganda. Only his family knew what really happened. In April 1945, after American forces captured his town, Lucy revealed the truth, the ultimatum, the cyanide, the final moments. For the first time, the real story of Rommel's death came to light. She lived the rest of her life quietly, preserving the truth behind the legend. Manfred Rommel's path after the war became something his father could never have imagined. After finishing secondary school in 1947, he studied law and political science at the University of Tübingen. He joined the Christian Democratic Union in 1953 and rose through the civil service of Baden-Württemberg. His colleagues knew his surname, but he rarely spoke about his father in professional settings. In December 1974, Manfred ran for mayor of Stuttgart and won. He became the first CDU mayor of a German city with more than 500,000 residents, and he would be re-elected twice, serving for 22 years. His political style was defined by tolerance and pragmatism, championing the integration of foreign workers and making controversial decisions that earned respect across party lines. Perhaps the most striking chapter of his public life was his friendships with the sons of his father's wartime rivals. He formed close bonds with U.S. Army Major General George Patton IV, stationed near Stuttgart, and with David Montgomery, 2nd Viscount Montgomery of Alamein. Both friendships were widely seen as symbols of reconciliation and West Germany's integration into NATO. In 1996, Chancellor Helmut Kohl presented Manfred with Germany's highest civilian honor. He also received the British CBE and the French Légion d'honneur. After retiring, he wrote several books and remained active as a public speaker despite suffering from Parkinson's disease. He died on November 7, 2013, in Stuttgart. In 2014, Stuttgart Airport was officially renamed Manfred Rommel Airport in his honor. The story of Erwin Rommel didn't end with his death or even with the revelations that followed. The myth that formed around his name became a tool for interests he never anticipated. As early as 1946, his former chief of staff Hans Speidel wrote that he intended to make Rommel the hero of the German people. Speidel had been part of the July 20th conspiracy and survived the war. In the early 1950s, as West Germany prepared to rearm under NATO, Speidel promoted both Rommel's and his own roles in the resistance. The strategy worked. Speidel became one of the founders of the Bundeswehr and, in 1957, was appointed Supreme Commander of NATO's Allied ground forces in Central Europe. For the Western Allies, Rommel became what historian Peter Caddick-Adams called the acceptable face of German militarism. His forced death made him easy to present as a victim of the regime rather than a participant. The biographies, Hollywood films, and published papers of the early 1950s reinforced this image, smoothing the path for West German rearmament. Germany's largest military base, the Field Marshal Rommel Barracks at Augustdorf, still carries his name. For decades after the war, veterans of the Afrika Korps gathered annually at his grave in Herlingen, including former British and Commonwealth opponents. But recent scholarship has challenged the myth. Historians such as Alaric Searle and Peter Leap have questioned the extent of Rommel's involvement in the July 20th plot and examined his relationship with the regime more critically. The debate continues. Was Rommel a reluctant soldier trapped by circumstance, or a willing participant who benefited from the system until it turned against him? His death was meant to end quietly, hidden behind a state funeral and a lie about his wounds. Instead, it became one of the most debated legacies of the entire war. If this gave you a new perspective on one of history's most controversial commanders, subscribe now, because there are plenty more untold stories like this one waiting to be explored.